Direktore, možemo li? Dragi profesori, ekscelencije, selamu alaikum i dobro vam večer. Držim da smo privilegovani večeras, s obzirom da je među nama jedno od najprepoznatljivijih intelektualnih imena Velike Britanije, mogu da kažem i muslimanskih intelektualnih imena Evrope, ali to nije ni potrebno, jer naš večerašnji gost, profesor Ziauddin Sardar, nije samo muslimanski intelektualac, on je i, kako se kaže obično, mainstream intelektualac, neko ko je dao doprinos studijama budućnosti, studijama identiteta, postmodernističkim studijama, kulturalnim studijama. Mislilac koga objavljuju Oxford University Press i slične kuće. Rođen je 1951. godine u Pakistanu, a odrastao i školovan u Engleskoj. Iza sebe ima bogato spisateljsko i radno iskustvo. Objavio je kao autor ili koautor, urednik, preko 30 knjiga na različite teme, od toga kako čitati Kur'an i o gradu Meki, biografiju grada Meke, do studija budućnosti, do uvoda u postnormalna vremena. Ima više dokumentarnih filmova urađenih i emitiranih na BBC-u, na Channelu 4, na TV Tiga i svakako na stotine članaka u akademskim i stručnim časopisima, ali i u Guardianu, Independentu, New Statementu i tako dalje. Našoj publici je bio predstavljen po prvi puta početkom 90. godina, 1990. 1991. i 1992. kada je bivši reis ulema Mustafa Cerić preveo i objavio jedno od njegovih ranih dijela Lica islama. Nažalost, ja sam danas ponovo gledao te glasnike i u bibliografiji piše da je rat obustavio i da nije kompletirano to izdanje. Nakon rata na bosanskom, hrvatskom i srpskom jeziku objavljeno je više njegovih dijela o darvinizmu, o orijentalizmu, o islamu, a posljednje izdanje je zapravo izbor eseja o islamu, budućnosti i nauci i znanju. Ja mislim da je, i mogu zapravo da zaključim, da je po anketama magazina Prospekt naš večerašnji gost jedan od 100 najutjecajnijih britanskih javnih intelektualaca. Mislim da je to dovoljno, ovo je samo izvod, biografija i bibliografija našeg večerašnjeg gosta. Zapravo bibliografija je stala na nekih 9,5 gusto kucanih stranica teksta. Mislim da će za početak biti dovoljno. On će nama večeras govoriti na temu budućnost islama u Evropi. Mislim da je teško bilo naći pozvanijeg govornika da govori na govornici Centra za dijalog, iz prostog razloga što, kao što ste čuli, bavi se i islamom, i budućnošću, i kulturnim odnosima u Evropi i sam živi u Londonu. Ja pozivam profesora Sardara da nam se obrati.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. First of all, I should apologize for the fact that I don't speak Bosnian. so you will have to put up with my English. Second, I must say it gives me immense pleasure to be here, not just in Bosnia, but in this wonderful, wonderful, great hall. I have spoken at numerous places, virtually in every Muslim country, in all varieties of halls. I've spoken at halls which had no roofs. I've spoken in halls which had no chairs. I have spoken at halls that have been luxurious conference halls, but I have never spoken in a hall that has such comfortable chairs. And I hope you're all sitting very, 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 very comfortably. The title that I was given for this lecture is The Future of Islam in Europe. And immediately, I look at the three words, future, Islam, and Europe, and I see problems. All three terms are problematic for me, and I assume if you think about it, they are probably problematic for you too. So let us very briefly look at the terms first before we explore potential future horizons. Take the term future. I plan to go to Montenegro tomorrow, and from Montenegro I plan to go back to London. Now that's the immediate future I have planned for myself, but a number of things can happen in between that may disturb my planned future. A very good example of that is about 4 or 5 years ago, I was in Bucharest, and I was in a conference that in fact I was running, and I couldn't wait for the conference to finish so I can get back home. And when the conference finished, I felt so relieved. I said, tomorrow I'm going to fly off. And so when I actually went to do my kind of online check-in, I just thought I'll check the weather, and I discovered that a volcano had been erupted in Iceland. Now I assure you I had absolutely nothing to do with that volcano, right? It just erupted on its own accord. But it totally destroyed my future plans. In fact, it totally destroyed my future. So instead of going to London by flying the following day and arriving the same day, first of all, I had to hang around in Bucharest for 3 or 4 days, hoping that there will be flight, because all the airports were closed down. There was this volcanic ash all over the place. Then eventually I managed to get a train. So I had to get a train from Bucharest to Vienna, 9 hours in a third-class carriage, which was a wonderful experience. Then overnight train from Bucharest to Zurich. Then from Zurich I took a night train to Vienna, and then from Vienna I took another train to Paris. And then from Paris I took a train. I stayed overnight in Paris, and then from Paris I took a train, a Eurostar, to London. So instead of arriving in London the following day as I planned, it took me a week to actually get back to London. And both my family and my wife were kind of in this total state of to worry, when is Dad going to get home? I mean, that was the constant kind of phrase. So you can plan a particular future, but all sorts of things can actually happen which can change that future. So the first thing one needs to appreciate is that there is a certain uncertainty about the future. And the future is not simply a prior, a given. There are a number of futures, and these futures may be different for different people. When I was coming here to give this lecture, I came out of the hotel, and I passed a little young girl who was sitting there, and I just walked past her. And then it just occurred to me that her face, there was some agony on her face. So I walked back, and I kind of touched her, and I asked her, what is wrong? And she burst into tears. Right? And of course, she didn't speak English, so I didn't understand, so I didn't know what she was saying. But she was clearly in agony. She was clearly suffering. Right? What is her future? Is her future the same as mine? There are so many people sitting here who are quite young. My future is maximum 20 years. Even if I live more than 20 years, I probably end up suffering from dementia, so it's not going to mean very much. But there are people here who will live for 30, 40, 50 years. So their future is totally different from mine, at least in terms of time scale, if nothing else. And if these young people are married or are planning to get married and they have children, then of course a child is not just a child. It brings in a number of factors that affect the future of the parent as well as the future of a child. I mean, an average child, in my experience, causes you 7 years of sleepless night. Because, for first 3-4 years, they're perpetually crying and getting up in the middle of the night. And after when they're 3 or 4 years old, and you're fast asleep, they come and jump in your bed and wake you up. I mean, on average, I have 3 children, and I keep telling them that they ruined 21 years of my life. Each child costs you 7 years of sleepless night, in a sense. But then, of course, a child, then you have to think about the child, you have to think about the schooling of the child, then you have to think about, whether the child should go to university, you constantly worry about whether they're going to get a job. So a child who arrives actually shapes the next 20, 21 years of your future, in a sense. Right. So there are multiple futures when we are talking about. And when we simply have to ask, whose future are we talking about? And simply to say the future of Islam in Europe just does not make sense. So the first thing we need to do is to say futures of Islam in Europe. And in those futures, there will be many factors that will be outside Islam and Europe. For example, both the future of Islam, if it is one future, and the future of Europe will be affected by the decline of America. Now, America is in a state of decline, and we know when a superpower declines, it's like a wounded animal, and it behaves in a totally different manner, right? It kind of hits out. A declining America may actually hit out. Certainly it will hit out on Islam, as we have already seen, but it may also hit out on Europe. In fact, the signs of that are already there. So it's not just Islam and Europe, but in fact what is happening to the globe as it in itself will affect these futures. So we are talking about a very complex phenomenon. We are talking in pluralistic terms, futures, and we are talking about in a world that is globalized and interconnected. Let's take the next term, Europe. The first question is, where is Europe? Now, you may think this is a very simple question, where is Europe? But in fact, it's a very complicated question. For example, to this very day, we have no idea whether Turkey belongs to Europe or not. We know that a little bit of Turkey is in the European continent, but we don't know whether Turkey belongs in Europe or not. Why is this question so difficult? Because we don't know where is Europe. In fact, the borders of Europe actually ended in what we call Eastern Europe. There was Western Europe, which was Europe proper. Then there was Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe was Eastern Europe because it had certain characteristics that could also be identified with the East. Part of that Eastern Europe was part of Ottoman Empire. Part of that Eastern Europe was where the gypsies came from. That's where racism actually began, on the borders of Hungary, on the borders of Romania, on the borders of Slovakia. So that Eastern Europe was not simply Eastern Europe because it was geographically east. It was also Eastern Europe because it was slightly different from Western Europe, which was, of course, the original Europe in that sense. So the question, where is Europe, is not easy to answer. Then, what is Europe? Now, if you think about it, it is a very complex question to answer. What is Europe? What does Europe signify? If you ask a French person, he will say European values are French values. European values are about enlightenment. European values are about liberal humanism, right? And the French actually think that they invented civilization. There was no civilization before France came into being, as it were. And Paris is the bastion of haute couture, and you have this in this Europe, a woman who is dressed in the latest fashion, wearing a Gucci scarf, walking in the streets of Paris, is regarded as the height of civilization, height of European values. But another woman wearing the same dress and wearing a scarf, who happens to be a Muslim, walking on the same street, is regarded as a threat to civilization, as a negation of European values. If you ask, what is Europe in Britain, there will be certain people who will say, in fact, these people are now a political party known as UKIP, United Kingdom Independent Party, who say, actually, Europe is simply a collection of different states, and we in Britain have nothing to do with the rest of them. We should actually disconnect from them. We have our own currency, we have our own queen, we have our own British values, whatever they are. We don't really belong to the rest of Europe. In fact, they are a drain on us. We have to pay a vast number of billions every year to European community. We should leave the European community and just be on our own. And their notion of Europe is totally different, in a sense. Or if you ask, say, somebody from Greece, that Greece has suffered tremendous kind of economic decline over the last few years. Here was a European country reflecting European wealth, European values, but within a few months, it was a pauper state like Bangladesh. What does Europe mean to them now? They are on the verge of actually defaulting, which means they will have to, even if, whether they want or not, they will be leaving Europe. So what is Europe is a very interesting question, and there is no real answer to that. But what part of the answer to what is Europe is also that Europe is a conceptual idea. That when we talk of Europe and we talk of European values, in the same breath we talk of the West and Western values, that European values are essentially global values, and they are translated into Western values. Right. So Europe is also a global concept. And there are lots of things associated with Europe, as though Europe invented them. The idea of human rights, for example, the idea of freedom of expression, as though there were no human rights before Europe came into being, or nobody had freedom of expression before Europe came into existence. So Europe is also a conceptual category, and it's an important conceptual category. So apart from asking where is Europe and what is Europe, we can also ask, how is Europe? Well, it's in a pretty bad shape. It's pretty ill at the moment. And if the global economic crisis continues, it could be in even bad shape. If Greece defaults, it could be in a pretty appalling shape. But the most interesting thing is that what you and I think of as European values are actually being negated by a vast number of Europeans who are embracing fascism. You yourself have an experience of European fascism in Bosnia. Now there are big, huge organizations. In Greece, Golden Dawn. In Britain, National Front. All over Scandinavia, nationalist fascist party actually in power. In France, 25% of the people vote for National Front. 25. 1 in 4 people in France subscribe to fascist values. So Europe itself is not in a very good state at all. if we ask the question, how is Europe? Well, Europe is puerile in that sense, which is very interesting because if we are talking about future of Islam in Europe, or futures of Islam in Europe's, because Europe's, there is no such thing as Europe, it's now Europe's. There are a number of different Europes, different perceptions of Europe, different conceptual structures of Europe. It's not just the European Union. It's all those fascists who are part of various countries. They're also part of the part of Europe. Europe is exactly the same place where you have, as I said, you could have two different women wearing the same headscarf, and one is regarded as a height of civilization, while the other is regarded as a threat to civilization. So you may actually think, why should Islam be part of Europe in the first place? Of that Europe that is not all that well, that is going towards a direction which actually negate the very values that Europe subscribes to. That's an interesting question that we can explore. Then we come to the idea of Islam. So when we talk about futures of Islam in Europe's, what are we talking about? What is Islam? I've been trying to find out for the last 50 years of my life, and I have not reached this conclusion or a sensible answer. When we talk of Islam, what are we talking about? Are we talking about Sunni Islam? Are we talking about Shia Islam? Are we talking about Ismailis or the Sufis? Are we talking about Sheikh Qardawi, who says that jihad should be declared on the Shias? Or are we talking about the Shia Iran, which is a theocracy? Are we talking about Saudi Arabia, which is an authoritarian, nasty piece of work? What are we talking about when we are talking about Islam? Which Islam? Where does this Islam actually exist? So there are a number of Islams as well. So the first thing we need to do is to change the title of the talk. So instead of Future of Islam in Europe, it should be Futures of Islams in Europe's. The emphasis on plurality of each term. Now that's essentially my first message, that we live in a world which is pluralistic, intrinsically pluralistic, and deeply diverse. And we need to learn both to engage with plurality and diversity and appreciate and understand it, in a sense. So now let's get back to the whole question of the futures of Islam in Europe. The future, or futures as I was talking about, is not something that emerges out of nothing. I was talking about people here getting married. Now, a decision to have a child is a decision that is taken now, and that decision in the now will affect your life for the next 20 years. In fact, it will affect the rest of your life. So the future is a function of the decisions we make in the present. But the present itself is a product of what has happened in the past. Why is Bosnia in the shape that it is? Because it has experienced certain history in the last 10, 20, 30 years. Why are all the developing countries developing? Because they have gone through colonization. And therefore, their future is a function of both what they're experiencing now and the history that they have experienced. So if you're going to talk about futures of Islam in Europe, we need to take into account both history of Islam in Europe as well as the present of Islam's and Europe's. Now, the history of Islam and Europe is a very interesting, very interesting history. Of course, before there was Europe, there was Christendom. And after there was Europe, there was the West. But basically, the three things are, for our purposes, more or less the same thing. And when Islam first emerged, Christendom had three main problems with Islam. The first problem was a religious one. Why do you need a new prophet in Arabia when God's own son has died for the sins of humanity? It's a very basic religious problem. The second was the intellectual problem, that Europe was in the Dark Ages and Islam had many things going for it, not least it was a rising civilization, science, thought, learning, and so on and so forth. Great cities like Baghdad, Cairo, Damascus, Samarkand, Bukhara, and so on and so forth. And the third, of course, was a military problem. How did Christendom encounter these problems? Because how Christendom has in the past tackled these problems tell us something about our present and throw some light on what we may expect in the future. Well, the military problem was solved by colonizing the world of Islam. The intellectual problem was solved by creating a whole discipline which came to be known as Orientalism, a structure of knowledge which made Islamic knowledge inferior. And the religious problem was basically solved by combining Orientalism and colonization, and actually making Muslims feel inferior about their own religion. But the history of relationship between Islam and the West is not just a history of relationship of conquest and Orientalism. It has another dimension as well. And that dimension is the dimension of cross-fertilization, of how the two cultures came together and enriched each other. If we look at, for example, what happened in Andalusia, where Christendom, Islam, and Judaism came together to create a vibrant multicultural society that was open, that was vibrant, where thought, learning, philosophy, mysticism thrived. We see that Christendom and Islam can actually come together in a very productive way. Indeed, as I was saying earlier on, if you ask a European, particularly French, and more British and now Germans, etc. as well, what is so unique about Europe? The first thing they will say is the Enlightenment. But actually, Enlightenment had little to do with Europe. Enlightenment was Islam's gift to Europe. There would have been no Enlightenment without Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, Al-Farabi, the great thinkers of Islam. In Andalusia, you had a vibrant culture with a great genius at the center, whose name was Ibn Rushd, the philosopher. And his friend, Ibn Tufayl, who was also a philosopher. Ibn Tufayl wrote a wonderful novel called The Life of Hay, in which Hay spontaneously is generated from slime and comes out of the mud on an island and is adopted by a swan. And the novel shows that how, in fact, you could use reason with what Hay does. He used reason to discover the world, to shape the world, to make instruments, and so on and so forth. It actually shows how you could use reason to actually both build a culture and a society and eventually reach a realization that there is a creator. And Ibn Rushd's philosophy was essentially a phenomenal exercise in rationalism. The tragedy is that in Islam, the thoughts of Ibn Rushd and Ibn Tufail were suppressed, but Ibn Rushd became a major component of European thought, where a school of Averroism, because his Latin name was Averroes, a school of Averroism emerged. And enlightenment came out of that mix. In fact, Averroist scholars, the European Christian Averroist scholars, were so enthralled by Ibn Rushd's thought that the church felt threatened. The church said that this type of free thinking, because they were all free thinkers, is going to have a very bad effect on us, and try to suppress Averroistic thought. So enlightenment actually was based, the foundation for the European Enlightenment was provided by Islamic thinkers, Islamic thought and learning. If you ask a Frenchman, what is the second most important value of Europe? He will say liberal humanism. I mean, wherever you go, we want liberal humanism. That is the value of the West, that is the value of Europe. Where did liberal humanism come from? Well, liberal humanism comes from what we used to call adab literature. Adab literature was a literature that was developed in early Islam. And if you know the word adab means etiquette. The function of adab literature was to humanize people. It was a literature of thought, it was a literature of creativity, it was a literature of art and music, it was a literature of literature. Virtually all the humanistic values that we talk of today can be traced back to the adab literature. How did Europe repay Islam? It repaid Islam. First, it appropriated the thought which built enlightenment. Second, it appropriated the humanism and the universities. The European universities were modeled on our universities by doing three things. Instead of acknowledging the fact that a great deal of European ideas and thoughts are based on Islamic notions and Islamic history, Europe invented a Greek heritage. So here you have the Enlightenment and liberal values which are emerging from Islam, and they said, no, all this comes from Greece over there, right? In fact, Europe would have known nothing about Greece or Plato or Aristotle if there was no Islam. Indeed, Europe did not even discover Aristotle till the 18th century because certain works, Arabic works on Aristotle, were not translated into Latin. So it invented a Greek heritage. Second, it laid the foundation of law and order on Rome. Now, the Romans are the only civilization and culture, the Roman Empire, which has no science. If you look at various different cultures and civilization, all cultures and civilization will have some notion of science. Romans only had technology, and they were only interested in conquest. But they also had law. So Roman law then became the basis of European society. And third, Europe made Islamic history invisible. So his great history of science and technology became invisible. Andalusia disappeared from the intellectual maps of the world. So if we are talking about future of Europe, or especially futures of Islams in Europe, the first thing we need to do is to reconnect that history, because Europe is as Islamic as Pakistan or Turkey. And unless we do something about this gross injustice, there is absolutely no point talking about Europe or indeed talking about Islam in Europe. So that's the past that we must acknowledge. And if we're going to have a viable future, you have to acknowledge the past, and you have to address some of the injustice of the past. You cannot correct all the injustice, but at least you can address them. You can make people aware of them, in the sense. And then, of course, there is the present. And I've already mentioned that the European present is, for me at least, is very, very frightening. About 10 years ago, when I was a columnist in the New Statesman had this strange idea. The editor just rang me up one day and he says, have you got next week or 10 days free? So I said, depends on how much you're paying me. So he offered it some and I said, I'm free. And he said, what we're going to do is we're going to take you and drop you in the middle of Germany. You will not know where we drop you. And there'll be a photographer with you. And you two, the photographer and you, will travel from the city in Germany, which we were not telling you what the name. In fact, I've even forgotten the name of the city. From there to Lille in France, right? And wherever you go, you'll travel by bus, by rail. You will tell people that you are Muslim, and then you will emphasize the fact that you are, not just tell them, emphasize the fact, I am a Muslim. And then we want you to kind of tell us what the people's reactions are. How do they react to you? So I did the journey. It was a cover story on New Statesman. I will not tell you what the title is because I'm going to reveal it later on. But I can tell you that every step of the way I met the most brutal kind of racism you can imagine. That racism has now today multiplied by several fold. There's a whole new discipline of Islamophobia whose sole function is to demean Muslims and Islam, is to present Muslims as the darker side of the West, just as Orientalism did, as the darker side of the West. Now the interesting thing is this, that in an interconnected, globalized world, we asked the question, where is Europe? And we also said that Europe is a conceptual category. In a globalized, interconnected world, Europe is everywhere and nowhere. There's more Europe in Bombay than in Bradford. I want you to think about it. Check out something about Bradford. Yeah. There's more Europe in Kuala Lumpur than in the banlieue of Paris. It's very interesting. It's worth looking into the banlieues of Paris. When the French went to Morocco, they discovered cities like Fez and Marrakesh. And these are absolutely fabulous cities. I mean, these are cities which were built with the notion of carrying capacity. I know there's some architects here. These were cities which were built with the notion of carrying capacity. They were built on rivers with awareness of water supplies, with how sewage is treated, and the walls and magnificent cities. But of course, they were not European cities, they were Islamic cities, so they had to be inferior by definition. So what the French did, they built the new Fez outside Fez for themselves, the European Fez. And they said, Medina, inferior. European Fez, superior. Then some decades later, the situation is reversed. Moroccans and Tunisians and Algerians come to France. And this is Paris. This is Paris. It is the center of the universe. But you don't want these Arabs in the center of Paris. So now what they do, they build the banlieues. Purpose-built, nasty pieces of work, the most atrocious architecture you can possibly find, so that these people are outside. Now the center is superior, and the periphery is inferior. Earlier on, during colonial period, the center of Fez was inferior, but the periphery that the French built was superior. Now, these mental frameworks, they don't disappear overnight. You may think they are history, but they are present today, and they will have a major impact on the future. And if we want a viable future, we have to attack the mental framework as well. And we have to kind of not just reveal, but ridicule and abuse the racism that comes from these mental categories. In France, in Germany, in Scandinavian countries, Scandinavian countries supposed to be the kind of the paradise, they're supposed to be the heavens for equality and social justice. And in the 70s and 80s, when I was growing up in London, we used to look at Sweden, how wonderful and equitable society it is, and Denmark, right? Now you go in Denmark and see how many fascists are running the street, screaming and shouting that Islam is going to take over the world. So both the history and the present of Europe is problematic. So what can we then say about futures of Islam in Europe? Let me leave you with 4 different scenarios that I think are possible. The story I wrote for the New Statesman when I traveled from the German town to Lille, in fact, the cover line of that story, and you can check that out because the cover story in New Statesman, was called The New Holocaust. Now, I did not actually make this argument, but some other people have made the argument that the Muslims are the new Jews of Europe. I think that we ought to be careful about making comparisons like that. I would not say that the Muslims are the new Jews of Europe. What I will say is that the Muslims were the original others of Europe who have arrived at home. So before the others were outside, the darker side of Europe, and now this darker side of Europe is within Europe. There are vast Muslim communities throughout Europe in that sense. And that is very disturbing for many Europeans. And the rise of fascism that we see in Europe, the rise of extremism, the anti-Islamic rhetoric, the kind of phobia that we see. Of course, some of it is a product of what Muslims are doing, like the Islamic State and jihadi suicide bombing and all that nonsense. But a great deal of that comes from the innate fear that Europe has of the other, the Muslims, the other that Europe could not reconcile in history and cannot reconcile today. So that presents a very, very dark scenario. Now, I should emphasize, this is only one possible future. Remember we said that there is no one future, there is no the future. There are a number of alternative futures. So this is a potential future. But I will say that the most likely future is business as usual. The most interesting thing about change is that more things change, the more they stay the same. So we can have lots of changes, but the mindset will stay the same. The problems with Islam will stay the same. And we will move from, if you like, crisis to crisis. There will be some adjustments here, but then some fascists will come up in some other place, then there'll be adjustments there, and then people will talk about multiculturalism, and then multiculturalism will be attacked, and so on and so forth. And we continue to move in the kind of limbo that Europe finds itself. The interesting thing is that systems have a great capacity to carry on from crisis to crisis, till something happens that causes total equilibrium and the system collapses, in a sense. So there is this potential future where we just continue as we are. It's a business as usual. Things change, but they don't change fundamentally. The mindset doesn't change. The history is not acknowledged. Yeah. A third potential future, a lot of people have talked about it, is what we may call the integrated Europe, where Muslims are integrated as an integral part of Europe. Now here, it is important to appreciate the power dynamic. It is Muslims who are integrating in Europe. The power still resides where it resides. It is Muslims who make the initiative and integrate with Europe, which is a better scenario than assimilation, which is what the French want. The French want Muslims to assimilate. In other words, abandon their identity, and if possible, abandon their faith as well, and become totally French. But then, of course, they can never be totally French because they are Arabs, and their French is always dodgy, right? Accent is not quite right, and of course, they don't basically, subscribe to 100% European values. There's always some problem, there's always problem with freedom of expression. So it's a slightly better option. There's an option for certain European countries. I think Britain is one example where you could have a kind of integrated Europe or an integrated Britain where Muslims are integrated and feel relatively safe. Already Muslims are in many respects much better positions than, say, Muslims in Germany or Muslims in France or Muslims in Spain, because Muslims in Britain basically are knocking at the corridors of power. We are in the media, we are in the House of Commons, we are in the House of Lords, we are in the judiciary, we are journalists, we are lawyers, and so on and so forth. And you can actually see that if you go in Britain, switch the television on, you can see how many Muslim faces will be in front of the camera, and if you know something about it, you will realize that there are many faces behind the camera as well. If you go to a court, you will see how many Muslim lawyers are defending or prosecuting. If you go to if you listen to politicians, you will find that one of the main spokesmen, Conservative Party is a Muslim. One of the main spokesperson, a prominent personality who will probably be a minister if Labour wins is a Muslim, and so on and so forth. All parties have representation, and you could have that model replicated in other European countries. So that's also a potential future. But the thing about integration is that integration is a two-way street. I can't integrate with you if you do not want to integrate with me. If I have to integrate with you, then you have to integrate with me as well. Right? So true integration has to be that Muslims integrate with Europe and Europe integrates with Muslims or with Islam. That will be the true integration. Because integration is not one-way street. What would that integration mean? What does Europe has to do, for example, to integrate with Islam? We can point out what Muslims have to do to integrate with Europe, but what does Europe have to do to integrate with Islam? That's a very interesting question. Well, one of the first things Europe has to do is to acknowledge its history, is to acknowledge the fact that Europe is in fact as Islamic as it is not, as it is European. And that acknowledgement has to end up in some practical terms. So it has to be part of secondary school curriculum. It has to acknowledge that the values it parades are not unique to Europe. In fact, they are equally important for Islam, and as far as history is concerned, they are the values that were produced in the classical period of Islam. Now, by embracing that history, the fear that Europe has of the other, I think, will disappear. Because all that Orientalism, the Greek heritage, these are fabricated, manufactured things. And once you dismantle the manufactured structure and real history comes to the fore, it will change the perception of Europeans as a whole, not just the intellectuals, but also common people. And if they grow up in being educated that this history is also European history, the history of Andalusia is not just the history of Islam, it's also the history of Europe, and it is also history of the world. And it has to be taught as such, in a sense. So I think the first thing is to embrace that history. And second thing is to acknowledge the fact that there is nothing unique about European values. Most cultures, I do not know of any single culture. People may have problem with human rights, but I do not know any single culture where people openly say, we want to suppress other human beings. They may actually do it in practice, but they don't openly say that. Most cultures will accept human rights, although they may argue that we are not happy with that, or we are not happy with that. I mean, most people will find torturing other human beings obnoxious and evil thing to do. In a sense. So there's nothing unique about European values. I think that if that point is acknowledged, then that woman who is walking in the streets of Paris wearing a scarf will not be seen as a threat to civilization, but will be seen as an alternative expression of culture and civilization. So we return to plurality in that sense, that the futures of Islam in different kinds of Europe essentially depend on how Europe and Islam embrace plurality and how they deal with diversity, whether they see diversity as a threat or whether they see diversity as a rich resource, which, as the Quran says, is basically there so that we may know each other. It is the question of knowing. And I think the real viable future, the future that I will subscribe to, I will describe as a transmodern future, where the best in modernity that Europe has to offer and the best in tradition that Islam has to offer are synthesized and are trans. They are over and above what has existed before. And therefore, a new synthesis has emerged, a synthesis that is based on pluralism. And a synthesis that actually teaches Islam and Europe one fundamental lesson that neither of them have learned. And that lesson is this, that there is more than one way to be human. That's the future I want. And that's the future I think you should all work towards. Thank you very much.
Kad hoćete da pozovete javnog intelektualca iz Engleske ili Francuske, da znate da morate biti pomalo avanturist. Ja znam da je kod nas taj koncept pomalo stran, ali da znate da smo dobro prošli. A sad, vaša pitanja i komentari, izvolite. Ima li pitanja? Možemo postaviti pitanja na dva načina. Imate papir ko ne želi da ustaje i tako dalje. Imate papir, mogu ga pokupiti ovdje naši asistenti. Ili možete postaviti lično, samo ćemo morati imati mikrofon zbog prevodilaca. Je li ima mikrofon, Mirne se Evo, donijet će mikrofon, evo lakše.
Želim da se zahvalim i profesoru Ahmedu i naravno prije svega gostu na ovom predavanju. Ja bih htio 2-3 stvari da kažem zbog nedostatka vremena, neću možda stići da to obrazložim. Dakle, mi smo ovdje vidjeli jedan pluralistički pristup i naravno kroz ovaj pluralizam izbila je jedna zajednička dimenzija unutra, jedna konstanta. A ta konstanta koja izbija iz ovog pluralizma, ona nimalo nije obećavajuća, ako tako mogu da kažem. A drugo što bih htio, čini mi se da ovdje imamo jednu neujednačenu terminologiju. Imamo pojam Evrope i islama. Ako bi trebali da govorimo o ujednačenoj terminologiji, onda bi bila Evropa, Azija, Afrika, islam, kršćanstvo, jevrejstvo, hinduizam. Dakle, s druge strane, imamo pojam nacije, s jedne strane i s druge strane pojam islama i pojam religije. Dakle, sve vrijeme kada profesor govori o evropskim narodima, on govori o Francuzima, Englezima, građanima Sjedinjenih Američkih Država, a s druge strane govori o muslimanima. Ko su ti muslimani? Mi imamo danas 57 muslimanskih država. Imamo jake muslimanske nacije. Ako su to Arapi, ako su Turci, ako su Iranci, ako su, sad da ne kažem, Tunižani, ako su Alžirci, ako su Indonežani, ako s druge strane govorimo o Francuzima i Englezima, zašto da ne govorimo i s druge strane kada je u pitanju islamski svijet o nacijama, dakle kao jednoj konstanti, jednoj kategoriji koju kao takvu mi imamo. Dakle, tu mi se čini da zapravo jedna disproporcija leži. I drugo, profesor je trebao za to istraživanje da dođe ovdje 1995. godine u Srebrenicu ili u Sarajevu. Mi smo imali genocid, imamo ga ovdje. Dakle, novi holokaust, on je već tu. I treća stvar, ja ne vidim u ovom izlaganju, kada je riječ o islamu u Evropi, ni Albance, ni Bošnjake. Mi smo, dakle, jedan Albanci i Bošnjaci, autentični evropski narod. Iza nas ima određena tradicija. Profesor možda i može da se vrati u Pakistan, ali gdje ćemo se mi vratiti? Ako, dakle, u Evropi očekujemo jedan novi holokaust. To je bilo moje.
Hvala. Ja predlažem da uzmemo još jedno, 2, 3 pitanja, pa onda eventualno damo profesoru riječ, mada ja sam već dobio ovdje listu. Ja. Sure.
Thank you very much. When I was talking about Islams, I raised the question, whose Islam are we talking about? I said whether we are talking about Shias or Sunnis or Sufis or Saudi Arabia or Iran, which particular variety of Islam we are talking about. So I had already kind of presented a diverse and pluralistic notion of Islam, if you like. Now, if you had given me another hour, then I would have gone through Indonesia and Malaysia and Pakistan, if that's what you want. It doesn't make sense to me to talk about nations when you're talking about Muslims in Europe, because Muslims in Europe are communities. Even Bosnia is a community. Albanians are a community. You know, they're not like, it's not like Pakistan or Indonesia. We are dealing with communities in that sense, and these are diverse communities. I mean, in Britain, for example, we have, of which I have personal knowledge, we have numerous varieties of Muslims. I mean, there's community of communities. Their network of communities, if you like. So it is, since we are talking about Muslims within Europe, and they are already here, and some, as you pointed out, are indigenous to Europe. It makes greater sense to me to talk about communities than to talk about nation state. And of course, I have a lot of problems with the whole idea of nation state itself, including the nation state of France and nation state of Spain and nation state of Pakistan. Yes, I suppose I am guilty of not talking about the massacre in Srebrenica and the kind of that history you have suffered. But I thought that I should respect the audience and hint rather than spell it out. And now, if you are not capable of taking a hint, that is your problem and not my problem in that sense, right? But I would think that the most people here are pretty intellectual thinkers, professors, students. They're capable of making the connection. I don't have to make the connection. I don't have to pinpoint that out. I was disturbed by this young girl that I was talking about. When I was coming here, I met a young girl who had clearly something was disturbing her very deeply. And I felt ashamed of myself for not being able to help her. So you can imagine how I felt when I watched on television what was going on. My brother was loading trucks of medicine and bringing them here. He brought 3 trucks. Twice he got arrested. And my daughter, who was in those days not even 20, was running around, gathering funds and doing what? The kind of pain that we felt and the shame. The shame came 2 ways. The shame was one that this is Europe. This is happening in Europe. And we regard ourselves as European Muslims. Right? And we felt shame because as Muslims we could not help. We were powerless to help other Muslims, in a sense. So you don't have to lecture. You don't have to give me a lecture about Bosnia and Srebrenica. I know it very, very well. The question is that it is not just Bosnia and Albanians who are indigenous Muslims. I am indigenous Muslim to Britain. My children were born in Britain. All those people who live in the outskirts of Paris and outskirts of Lyon, right? They've been living there for 40, 50 years. Their children were born in France. They're indigenous. So you do not have any special category of that you are the only European indigenous people. We are also indigenous. So it makes much greater sense for me to talk about communities, because we are communities within communities. And we are minority communities in that sense. In many places we are a minority community. And minority communities have special characteristics, features, threats, and risks in that sense. And therefore, it is important for us to appreciate what these risks are, how they will increase in the future. The whole scenario of the new Holocaust scenario, I said, this is one possible future where this threat can actually increase. Yeah. But there are other possible futures. And what I'm actually arguing for, is that we should work together. We should not create an other. We should not create non-Muslim other, just as Europe created a Muslim other. But in fact, move forward so that we can integrate together and create a new synthesis which is transmodern, which is different, which is not rooted in Islamic notions of otherness or European notion of otherness. Now, this may be a slightly sophisticated idea, but I hope you understand it, but if you don't, I'd be quite happy to show you some of my published papers and articles which explain it in much more detail.
May I read to you 4 questions that we have received now here? Mm-hmm. I think I can group them into 4. Mm. First one, what Muslims should do individually and collectively during next 20 years in order to improve their prospects and the prospects of the scenario you were preferring? That's one. Yeah. Second one, how do you compare the futures of Islam in America to what you said about Islam? So America and Europe, what's the difference? Any difference in that regard?
US Islamic futures, okay, yeah.
And third one is, what is the future of Bosnian Muslims? I mean, how do Europeans look, how do you see it, Europe looks at Bosnian Muslims, and what's the future specifically for the Bosnian Muslim community in Europe? Okay. And the fourth one regards intra-Muslim relations. Mm-hmm. Do you expect more unity amongst the Muslims in the future, or more intra-Muslim fighting and disunity?
Okay. So the first question is, what should Muslim communities do in the next 20 years to enhance? Okay, yeah. Yeah, I cannot give you a kind of single answer to this question, because we need to appreciate both the diversity and plurality of the Muslim communities. And therefore, there will be different needs and different things in different places. So the Muslims in France, for example, have a different needs than say, Muslims in Britain, or Muslims in Germany, or Muslims in Scandinavia. But there are certain things that one can say. There are certain general things one can say. Is that one of the most obvious things Muslims can do is to come together as Muslims and to stop demonizing each other. What happens at a global level often is reflected at a community level in Muslim societies. So, for example, there's a Shia-Sunni war going on at the moment in the Middle East, and therefore we find a Shia-Sunni discord in Britain. Right. If you go to a mosque in France or in Germany, you are going to a Turkish mosque or a Moroccan mosque. You are not going to a mosque, right? Why do we need to put an ethnic label on a religious ideal in that sense? I think somehow we need to learn to live together as Muslims without demonizing each other, without questioning each other's aqidah or iman as though we are God and we go around measuring people's piety and whether they are good Muslim or bad Muslim in that sense. And I think that's part of the fact that the Muslims in general have a problem with plurality. Muslims everywhere seem to have problem with plurality. So the first thing I think we need to do is to come together in a sense. The second thing I would argue is that we must participate in mainstream society. So if you are an artist, you are not a Muslim artist, you are an artist, full stop. If you are a filmmaker, you're not a Muslim filmmaker, you are a filmmaker that stands up there amongst the best in the world. If you are an intellectual in Britain, people describe me as Muslim intellectual, but I don't describe myself as a Muslim. I'm just an intellectual. I'm a public intellectual. When people ask me what, I do a number of different things, and eventually I want to give a simple answer and don't want to engage with them for, in a long debate. I simply say I'm a public intellectual. It just so happens that I'm a Muslim, but I'm quite capable of commenting on British politics as much as politics in the Middle East. I can talk about, potential and possible futures, and I can look at the history of Orientalism. My Islam belongs to me, and virtually everything I do and say, it's kind of is imbibed there. It is there in virtually everything I say. But I don't have to label it. I don't have to write it on my chest. So in a sense, I think we need to kind of find mechanisms of becoming part of the mainstream and not be in some sort of Muslim ghetto, both physical and mental. And if we can do these two things, I think we'll make major progress. So what's the difference between U.S., the future of Muslim communities in America and the future of Muslim communities in Britain? Again, I think America is a very special case. Of all Islamophobia that you find, the worst variety comes from America. Even worse than the kind of fascism you find in France or in Scandinavia. And the Muslims in America are not proportionately pretty small. I mean, in Britain we are like 2.5, 3 million, so we are almost 3-4%. And we, are very, as I was arguing, quite kind of involved in the mainstream. And even in France, you'll see that the Maghribi community is quite kind of much more involved in the mainstream than in America. So I think the American Muslims have to struggle much harder to become part of the mainstream. And so that is their struggle for next 15, 20 years. And they face a much bigger onslaught of Islamophobia than we are facing in Europe. What do I think of Bosnian Muslim futures? Huh?
How do you see what
The future of Bosnia, was it?
how Europe sees Bosnian Muslims?
How Europe sees Bosnian Muslims?
Do you have any idea?
Well, if I can give you a very honest answer, and please don't be upset, Europe doesn't see Bosnia. Europe doesn't see Bosnia. Europe only sees Muslims when they are being attacked or when they are suffering, when there's an earthquake, when there's a famine, or flood, something like that. Otherwise, Europe doesn't see Muslims, and Europe certainly doesn't see Bosnia in a sense. And that's a challenge for Bosnia. That's a challenge, how Bosnia makes itself known to Europe and makes its presence felt in Europe, in a sense. Why is that the Holocaust is kind of perpetually invoked in Europe, in France, in Germany? There's every year there's a remembrance ceremony, hundreds of articles in the press. I've been invited numerous times to speak, at the Holocaust memorials here, there, and everywhere. Yeah. When did you last hear there was a memorial for the massacre in Srebrenica, or what happened in Bosnia? How many articles have been written in say, British or French newspapers about that? How many times have I been invited to speak at a memorial on the Holocaust that happened here? The answer is none. So that's a challenge for Bosnia, and it's a challenge for next 5-10 years. You have to make your presence felt in Europe, in a sense. And you have to make your presence felt in Europe despite all the obstacles that you will face. And one of the clear obstacles from European point of view is the fact that you are Muslim. That's an obstacle. I mean, I raised the question, why is Turkey not part of Europe? And I expect the audience to know the answer. This is why I did not give the answer, that Turkey is not part of Europe because Turkey is Muslim. And there is a whole history of seeing the Ottoman, the whole idea of Saracen comes from the Ottoman Turks. The Turkey that's where the big otherness begins. Hungary, Bulgaria, that's where racism begins. But the real dark side of Europe begins with the Ottomans, begins with Turkey in that sense. So that is one of the biggest obstacles. But I think you can do that very productively by developing relationships with other Muslim communities, with Muslim communities in Britain, with Muslim community in France, in Germany, and rest in Spain, and rest of Europe. There has to be exchanges, even intermarriages, if you like, so that that marriage is a great institution for improving relationships, making connection, and making yourself known in that. So that's what I think. The final question was, are
we going to see more or less
immunity? Yes. Well, given the present situation, I think the obvious answer is we are going to see more disunity in the future. The interesting thing is that Muslims have never really been united. I mean, the idea of the Ummah is a lovely romantic idea, but there's never really been an Ummah. I mean, look at it. What happened after the death of the Prophet? Within 20 years, right? There's a battle of Camel, where two members of his family are fighting each other. There is Karbala. There are the Kharjites, who are saying that all other Muslims are kafir, only we are the true Muslims, And then there's the Umayyads come along and, kind of basically they were dictators, right? And they were hardly into unity. And then the Abbasids, and, very interesting, that the Umayyads couldn't unite Damascus. But when one of them escaped in Andalusia, they created a great civilization. So there was a gem of genius there, but that genius did not extend to being united. So even in Spain, they were not united. And the fall of Granada, 1492, was essential because they were totally disunited, and they could not stand up in a united way to the Spanish kings and the Queen Frederick and Isabella. The truth is, it seems to be there's some mental category block or something that stops Muslims from uniting. They have never been united in history. And I think the solution has to be a conceptual change in what is Islam. There has to be a conceptual change in what is Islam. And this very notion of Platonic truth within Islam needs to be questioned. Now that's a very difficult thing to accept, and probably equally difficult thing for me to say. Right? This idea that Islam, in a monolithic sense, is the truth. If you accept that there are Islams, different varieties of Islam, then the logical thing is that each variety has its own notion of truth. Therefore, you accept there are different notions of truth about Islam. Clearly, for Shias and the Sunnis, one of the divisions is the notions of truth. In the Sunnis, the notions of truth are in the Tabayin, the early community of Muslims, and in Shia, the notions of truth are in the Imams. And that's a very despite the fact that they are both Islam, this is quite a fundamental difference. So somehow I think we need a category change. And that category change will come from Muslims in Europe. Because only Muslims in Europe have experienced plurality in a real sense. And thus only Muslims in Europe would develop pluralistic notions of Islam, in my opinion. And that is where the future is bright in that sense. And if that can happen, then change often happens from the periphery. If you look at the history of Islam, the major changes came from the periphery. And now the future of Islam in contemporary times belongs in the periphery. It belongs in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in Pakistan, in Morocco, in Turkey, in kind of Bosnia, these places. It does not belong in the Middle East. The changes will come from the periphery, and then the periphery will transform the center. And that's a very common natural law.
Profesore Sardar, zahvaljujem vam na ovom predavanju. Želim da vas podsjetim da vi govorite narodu koji, kao što je rekao jedan naš pjesnik, samo misli da je preživio genocid. Naime, nekoliko puta u našoj povijesti nama je zapriječeno nestankom. To je učinio njemački car Karlo V, to su učinili srpski i hrvatski fašisti 10 puta u našoj povijesti. Zato bih vas zamolio, ako možete, da nam napravite komparaciju između razloga, historijskih razloga zašto je uništen Endelus. I da li ti historijski razlozi, da li oni postoje u slučaju Bosne? Jer slučaj Bosne i genocid, ovaj posljednji genocid nad nama je počeo tačno 500 godina nakon Endelusa. 1492. godine učinjen je genocid nad muslimanima Endelusa, 1992. godine počeo je genocid nad nama. Ali muslimani Endelusa su, koliko ja znam, nestajali 200 godina? Drugo, da li u Evropi, osim ovih neofašističkih političkih snaga, da li ipak postoje neke realne snage koje ne bi dopustile onaj prvi scenarij o kome ste govorili? Želim da vas posjetim da jedan dio Evrope je zaista stajao i zapada, čak i te Amerike, stajao uz muslimane Bosne i čak su nam u nekome smislu pomogli. Da li će slučaj Bosne i naš strah da nam se ne dogodi novi genocid, da li će transformirati islamski svijet, budući da je tokom agresije i genocida na Bosnu, taj svijet koji danas ratuje na Bliskom istoku, zapravo u slučaju Bosne bio ujedinjen. Ti koji ratuju danas na Bliskom istoku, kada biste im postavili pitanje Bosne, oni bi jednako mislili o nama, jednako bi željeli da nam pomognu ili da se osjećaju s nama i slično. Moja su pitanja kompleksna, teška, ali vjerujte da i mi svi u duši nosimo i da je to najvažnije što nas zanima. Zahvaljujem.
Okay. Other questions?
One more, just to finish on this note. I have two papers here, both asking basically about the responsibility of Muslims. Sorry. I have two papers basically asking what is the responsibility of Muslims for the situation and you have described, I mean, mistrust and misconceptions of Islam and so on. So what is the responsibility?
You mean historically or now?
They don't say both historically. I think both more now than historically. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. I think you rightly pointed out these are very complex questions and require some serious thought before one can answer them. But I also appreciate that, especially in this part of the world, these are the questions that are integral part of your soul in that sense. Ibn Khaldun said history repeats itself. And therefore we need to be vigilant that certain aspects of history do not continue to repeat themselves, in a sense. The reason that the new Holocaust scenario is important, not that it will happen. The function of exploring the future is not to tell you that this is the future that will happen. The function of it is to make you aware that there's a possibility and a probability that it can happen. And if you appreciate the possibility that it can happen, then you have to prepare or fight against that. Either you have to prepare for that future or fight against that future in that sense. So I would say that given the overall situations in Europe and the rise of the neo-fascists, it is something that we need to be acutely aware of and prepare ourselves for, and politically and economically and militarily and in whatever other ways that we possibly can. But I also presented 3 other scenarios. One was integrated Europe, and the very basis of that scenario is that there are people in Europe who are aware of this possibility. They are aware that fascism basically is skin deep in Europe. I mean, only 50 years ago, Spain was fascist. You know, it's only 30 years the Vichy France, 30, 40 years Vichy France. We had the Nazis in Germany, right? So it's not a history that is forgotten. It's a history that is remembered. And there are lots of, I mean, in a sense, one of the points that I want to make, maybe it wasn't quite clear, the point of plurality, is that Muslims need to see Europe in pluralistic terms, just as Europe needs to see Muslims in pluralistic terms. What does that mean? That means we need to see Europeans as a human community. In a human community, there'll be people of all shades of opinion. There'll be people who are extremists, On one side, there be people who are absolutely liberal and open-minded and good on the other side, and there be all the varieties of different people in the middle. And those people who are aware of European history, are actually fighting for it, are actually, making sure that history, as Ibn Khaldun said, does not repeat itself. And we need to make alliances with those people in that sense. We cannot see Europe we cannot demonize, Muslims cannot demonize Europe because that is just as bad as Europe demonizing Muslims. And if you demonize others, you actually end up dehumanizing yourself in a sense. So that's the notion of plurality that I'm arguing for. What is the responsibility of Muslims now? That wasn't quite clear. I mean, the Muslims have numerous responsibilities.
No, I mean how responsible they are for what is going on. That's the.
Oh, how responsible they are for what is going on.
I'm bad translator.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay. In any kind of given situation, that is not very healthy, the responsibility lies in all participants. You can't just blame one single participant. Of course, Muslims are quite hell of a lot responsible for the kind of image they have created of themselves and of Islam. But as I keep emphasizing, we live in a globalized, interconnected world. So what may happen on the streets of Karachi would actually affect the Muslims in France and Britain, or may even affect the perception and images of Muslims in Bosnia. So, for example, if 9/11 had not happened, or 7/7, the London bombing hadn't happened, or the bombing in Spain hadn't happened, or the Charlie Hebdo affair hadn't happened, then the perception of Muslims would have been different. I grew up in Britain, my parents moved there in the 59, 60, something like that. And up to 1979 or up to 1980, Muslims in Britain were seen as model citizens. We were the most law-abiding, most hardworking, most reliable community of all the communities. If you go back and look at the literature on Muslim community before 1979, that's the description you get. Something happened in 1979, the Rushdie affair. And the first time, Muslims were presented as those who are not all that law-abiding and maybe do not actually believe in freedom of expression. And then 9/11 happened. And then the perception changed further. And then 7/7 happened. And then the question emerged, are Muslims loyal to Britain? Exactly the same question has emerged in France. And same question emerged after the Spanish railway bombing in Spain. So yes, the Muslims are responsible for. It may be that the communities themselves are not directly responsible, but their sisters and brothers elsewhere have undertaken actions that actually affect the perception. And also, I think Muslims are responsible in the sense that they're quite incapable of presenting a united front. There's always kind of infighting amongst them. So when there is a need arises for Muslims to negotiate with governments or those in power in a united fashion, there's always infighting, and then that presents a very bad image. In general, what I will say is all the faults that Muslims have, Muslims in Pakistan, if somebody wants to talk about it, or Iran or Malaysia, these faults exist in the Muslim communities in Britain, Muslim communities in Spain, and the Muslim communities in Bosnia. Because these faults are common fault, disunity, declaring the faith of other as inferior to your own, fearing the outsiders, etc., etc. I don't want to go into all the details. All these faults exist in all these communities. And I think what we need to do is to actually start looking at ourselves much more critically. I mean, in a sense, if we want a viable future, if Muslim communities or Islam desires a viable, thriving future in Europe, then that future begins by looking at our own selves and looking at our own selves critically. And in that critical reflection, we will discover many things which would tell us that unless we do something about them, we are not going to become thriving communities, and we do not have a viable future, not just in Europe, but anywhere. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Profesor Sardar. Dame I gospodo, ja se izvinjavam, imao sam još jedno ovdje pitanje. Ja nisam siguran da sam razumio, pa onda nisam htio ni da pokušavam postaviti ga. Profesor je završio svoje izlaganje govoreći da ako ima budućnosti, ona se sastoji u kritičkom odnosu muslimana prema samima sebi. U tom smislu želimo spomenuti da je trenutno profesor urednik časopisa koji se zove Critical Muslim, kritički musliman. I časopis redovno dolazi u Gazi Husrev-begovu biblioteku gdje ga možete posuditi. Veliki broj njegovih tekstova su dostupni na internetu. Rekao sam već da je nekoliko knjiga prevedeno, uključujući jedan dobar izbor koga imate ispred. A ja vam od svih njegovih tekstova toplo preporučujem da pročitate tekst Dobrodošli u postnormalna vremena. Dame i gospodo, to je sve za večeras. Hvala vam, vidimo se opet na nekoj narednoj govornici Centra za dijalog.